Hello, and welcome to the annual meeting of the Committee for Spanish Economic Advancement. We are here today to discuss the Spanish economy, and more specifically, the issue of unemployment, which currently stands at 20.5%. I am Ms. Ana Chavez, and I will be moderating today's discussion. Joining us are Spanish labor analyst, Mr. Hussein Hakim, Professor of Economics, Mr. Ronald Basin, Euro area analyst, Ms. Danielle Paglia, and Spanish official, Ms. Swati Shanmugasundaram. Before we begin our discussion on Spain's unemployment crisis, Ms. Paglia, could you please brief us on the current situation in the Euro area amidst the recent European sovereign debt crisis?
Over the past few years, the financial crisis that originated in the United States has stunned the world economy, especially the euro area. Indeed, the very survival of the euro as a single currency has been brought to question. As the recession took hold, the euro area saw real GDP shrink by about 4% in 2009. Arguably, due to the European Central Bank reducing the interest rates in 2010, the Eurozone began its recovery from the global recession and saw real GDP rise about 1.7%. Looking forward into 2011, we can expect to see real GDP to rise by 1.7%.
In order to get a better grasp of the current situation in the Eurozone, we need to not only analyze the output level of an economy, but also look at the overall level of prices. Professor, how has the euro area fared with regards to inflation?
According to the Harmonized Index of Consumer Prices, the primary indicator used in Europe to gauge the overall prices in the economy, before the recession, the euro area had experienced an inflation rate of 3.3%. However, as the financial crisis ensued, this rate lowered to 0.2% in 2009. With the economic recovery in 2010, the composite rate edged back up to a much healthier 1.7%. The figure is very close to the targeted figure of just under 2% set out by the euro area. As of March 31st, the euro area reported an inflation rate of 2.3% for the month of March, above the forecasted estimate of 2.6%. The ECB then decided to raise interest rates to cope with the possibility of further rise of inflation and an overall heated economy by raising the interest rate to 1.25%.
While it could be argued that some levels of inflation may be beneficial to euro area economies to help them cope with high debt levels, in the long term, high levels of inflation would actually be detrimental to euro area economies, such as Spain, a country that depends very heavily on imports from countries outside of the euro area.
Alongside a net decrease in real GDP and a near zero inflation rate during the recession, the euro area saw unemployment rates rise from 7.5% in 2008 to 9.9% in 2010. Compared to the United States unemployment rate of 8.9% in February of 2011, it seems noticeably larger, which could imply a harsher recession in the euro area. However, member nations of the Eurozone differ from the United States in that the Eurozone provides a more generous safety net for its people.
What needs to be noted here, however, is the deviation in statistics throughout the euro area. For example, the Netherlands enjoys a low unemployment rate of just over 4%, while Spain is currently suffering a staggering 20.5% unemployment, much of which can be classified as long-term unemployment.
What might we infer as to why Spain's unemployment rate contrasts so sharply with the Eurozone average?
Well, that's really the question we're trying to answer, and there's no one just clear-cut answer. So let's start with the construction sector. In 2007, it was estimated that the construction sector would have 13% of all employment, or 2.5 million jobs. This proved to be a rate that Spain could not sustain, as during the recession, this sector shed over 1 million jobs, or 40% of its workforce.
The magnitude of the drop in the overall level of home prices in Spain is a figure unique to Spain, unfortunately. According to the Índice Mercados Inmobiliarios Españoles, or the IMIE, what I prefer, there was a fall in index value of 2239 to 1839, or approximately 18%. As Spanish homeowners witnessed almost a fifth of the value of their homes disappear, demand for homes in the nation plummeted, and the construction industry, which arguably had already been employing an artificially high amount of labor, plummeted. The downturn of the construction industry accounts for nearly 20% of the unemployment in Spain.
Right, and a demographic closely related to the collapse of the construction industry is youth. Youth unemployment in Spain has reached well over 40%. According to a report published by the OECD, 15.3% of Spain's young people, here defined as those between the ages of 16 and 24, neither work nor study. The report also highlights that in 2009, Spain had one of the highest dropout rates at 35.6%, which is more than double the European average of 15%.
Why is the Spanish youth particularly susceptible to unemployment?
Over the last few years, as we've seen Spanish construction and tourism industries boom, we also saw a high portion of the youth population drop out of school and instead enter these lower skill level jobs during what seemed like to be a never-ending period of growth in the economy. But then as we also seen, as both of these industries plummeted, much of the youth population found themselves unemployed. With insufficient education and skills that were inapplicable outside their respective industries, much of the youth now finds it very difficult to find jobs.
It is true that part of the youth population did choose to enter the labor force prematurely prior to the recession. However, many also decided to continue to seek higher education. So the question remains, why is so much of the youth unemployed?
Well, what the issue in Spain seems to be is that much of the education the youth is obtaining isn't corresponding very well to what firms in Spain are currently in need of.
What seems to be the most practical solution to reduce youth unemployment is to increase the availability of apprenticeships for all students attending vocational education by offering firms tax breaks for hiring a greater percentage of their employees as interns. Particular attention should be paid to setting the apprenticeship wage in a way that reflects the investment of the employer, thus ensuring sufficient apprenticeships. Furthermore, for these firms to receive tax breaks, they must maintain this employment for a specific period of time to prevent the abuse of this policy.
Well, I'm sorry, but I must disagree here. The Spanish budget deficit is already one of notable magnitude, equivalent to 6% of GDP. And for the government to implement these tax breaks would only put the Spanish economy at further risk. By pushing the federal deficit to higher levels and thereby adding another facet of risk to an already battered image, the Spanish government risks pushing their borrowing rate to further highs. These increased borrowing rates could very well impede investment and hinder job creation.
Well, Mr. Hakim, I believe what our Spanish official is aiming at is that these proposed tax breaks are by no means a long-term policy. It would be impractical for the Spanish government to implement such long-term policies with the respective long-term costs. Instead, by implementing specific tax breaks in the short term, the government is able to ideally put more people back to work. By putting these people back to work, the government may actually see revenue increase. For instance, say you have a 25-year-old male who's currently unemployed. At the moment, the government is losing money on this one worker. If somehow the government is able to employ this worker, not only would it not lose money on paying unemployment benefits, but it may even begin to see an increase in revenue through the taxation of this man's newfound income.
Well, what if unemployment benefits in Spain were too high and too generous? If this were to be the case, the youth would have a strong disincentive not to go out and seek work, and these proposed tax breaks would amount to nothing but an increased budget deficit.
Very good point. Mr. Hakim, what are the current unemployment benefits in Spain?
As it currently stands, unemployed persons in Spain are covered by two successive benefits: a contributory benefit lasting from 4 to 24 months, and an assistance benefit lasting for an additional 6 to 30 months. The contributory benefit allows for the unemployed to receive 70% of their previous salary. For recipients with dependents, this cannot drop below the minimum wage, and for those without dependents, this cannot drop below 75% of the minimum wage. For both of these groups, this cannot exceed 220% of the minimum wage. As far as unemployment assistance goes, this simply entails one payment per month of 75% of the minimum wage, regardless of factors such as dependence.
To give you a better idea of how generous unemployment benefits really are, consider this. A tour guide makes around 766 euros per month in Spain. If this tour guide found themselves unemployed, they would make nearly the same amount from unemployment benefits.
Many workers in Spain have very little incentive to commit the time or energy or even make the commitment necessary to enter a training program offered by firms or apprenticeships. By maintaining a generous system of unemployment benefits, the Spanish government not only incurs a substantial cost, but also an unemployed workforce that may not be too eager to re-enter employment. This is something that the Spanish economy can in no way afford to sustain.
Well then, what can be done by the Spanish government in response to this?
Both the contributory and assistance benefits should be gradually reduced over a period of time, with the assistance being reduced more aggressively than the contributory benefits. A decrease in these benefits will reduce the disincentive for workers currently receiving benefits to seek employment, which we believe will in turn increase the overall level of employment in the economy.
While this may be a necessary step in reducing unemployment, I must bring to question the many costs associated with it. True, it may incentivize the unemployed to find work and drastically reduce the government spending, but it could also cause social unrest, a factor we simply cannot ignore. It is therefore imperative that the Spanish firms have the ability to change wages to accommodate an increase in labor supply. I simply do not believe that the Spanish labor market is flexible enough to accommodate the needs of a larger labor force. The Spanish labor market is just too rigid.
What is meant here by a rigid labor market? What possible solutions can be put in place to combat this?
Employment contracts in Spain are predominantly found in either of two forms: temporary contracts and permanent contracts. Temporary contracts constitute approximately 30% of all labor agreements and make it relatively easy for firms to hire and fire workers. Now, on the other hand, permanent contracts, which make up the remaining majority of labor agreements, make it very difficult for firms to hire workers, and even more so if that firm was contemplating laying off workers. This acute case of essentially real wage unemployment can be alleviated by reducing some of the costs associated with permanent contracts.
As of the 2010 labor market reforms, for unfair dismissals on permanent contracts, severance payments in Spain are limited to 33 days for every year of service. Yet this number is still high in comparison to the EU average of 21 days for every year of service. It is very possible that these high severance payments is preventing Spanish firms from rehiring the workers and thus making a dent in the unemployment rate. And so this gap should be completely eliminated. By doing so, firms will now have more money to invest towards infrastructure, new technologies, and possibly even to create new jobs.
I completely agree with this solution, but what I don't see is that I still think that permanent contracts are still too expensive. They're not cost efficient for firms, and if the Spanish economy continues to maintain expensive permanent contracts, many firms in Spain will still be very hesitant to hire new and even younger workers, with the risk that the investment may not pay off.
What other labor market reforms, if any, should the government invoke to lessen rigidity?
As it currently stands, Spain's trial period is 6 months for qualified workers and 3 months for unqualified workers. Due to Spain's high unemployment rate, specifically structural unemployment, a thoughtful way to approach the situation would be to increase the trial period for both qualified and unqualified workers. The last thing the Spanish government needs right now is for firms to give up the chance of hiring a worker simply because they didn't have enough time to evaluate their potential worth. This will also provide a good medium through which youth can absorb themselves back into employment.
As of March 3, 2010, the European Economic and Monetary Union implemented the Europe 2020 strategy, which puts forth 3 mutually reinforcing strategies: smart, inclusive, and sustainable growth. How do the policies which we propose today parallel the goals set by Europe 2020, both in the short and long term?
Our short-term solutions of supply-side stimulus consisting of tax breaks for internships are consistent with the Europe 2020 strategies, which target a higher unemployment rate and a more knowledge-based economy. In the long term, our proposed labor market reforms will allow Spanish firms to become more competitive in the international marketplace.
The solutions we have proposed today have much to do with fiscal and welfare reforms, yet have hardly touched on the fact that Spain is part of the euro area, which is a significant feature considering it renders the government incapable of stimulating the economy through monetary policy. How might Spain's inclusion in the euro area affect policy initiatives in its domestic economy?
Well, lately what we've seen is that there's been particular attention being paid by the media towards the rate at which euro area nations borrow money, and more specifically, the growing discrepancy of this rate amongst nations. As of March 2011, the gap between Spanish and German borrowing rates was 216 basis points. Germany and Greece at 881 basis points, and Portugal at 428 basis points. The rate at which a nation can borrow is a crucial component of economic sustainability. Perhaps if the rate at which Spain borrows from the open market continues to increase, perhaps due to decreased perceived credibility, many of the fiscal stimulus measures which we have proposed today may not be entirely substantial enough to really hamper the unemployment rate, which Spain has trouble with today.
So after hearing all of this, I think it is fair to say that Spain's situation is one of complexity and depth, and one that will not be solved within the next couple years. It will take many years before we begin to see significant improvements in the economy take place, and as we have discussed, these changes begin with getting people back to work. Thank you for participating in the discussion. This meeting is now adjourned.
Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to broaden it out and ask you about the ECB raising interest rates. Why do you think it did that? And do you agree or disagree with that move?
I think the primary concern of the ECB was that as the euro area begins to recover from the recent financial crisis, it the ECB predicts that inflation may become a bigger concern for the euro area. As we've seen with the Phillips curve, which is arguable, some would say, we see that as unemployment decreases in nations, inflation tends to increase. And so the ECB is aiming to combat this by increasing interest rates.
Right. And so the reason, to be a little specific, that they raised interest rates was because in March there was a higher, inflation was reported at 2.6%, which is well over the target of 2% or just under 2% that the ECB set out. And so in order to combat this, in order to somewhat restrict the flow of money just to a certain extent so that inflation cannot become a problem in the economy, they had to raise the inflation rates, or the interest rates just slightly.
Which we agree with.
Thank you. Well, some people have predicted that this crisis is bad enough to lead to a breakup of the Eurozone. What do you think and why?
Well, I think that the thing we should consider here is the original reason why the euro area was created. Time, effort, and thought was put into this, and the conclusion reached was that the benefits outweighed the costs. When you analyze the consequences of moving from a preferential trade area to a free trade area, to a customs union, to a common market, and finally to the bold step the euro area took of an economic and monetary union, you simply find that the advantages, such as elimination of trade barriers, are substantial. In the short term, we may be facing numerous significant problems, but in the long term, the bottom line is that the original benefits still withstand and do outweigh the costs.
As Ms. Chavez said, there are many benefits to the euro. Like she said, there are no trade barriers. With no trade barriers, this means freer movement between the euro area, which means there's no tariffs, which is further incentive to trade. There's also no transaction costs. It was estimated in 2009 alone, $30 billion would have been wasted had the euro not been there. There's also a larger market, which reduces market uncertainty and is easier for say, Spanish firms to sell their goods in Germany or France, anywhere in the euro area. There's also perceived stability. Because there are 17 countries backing up the euro, it's perceived as a more stable currency. Even more than that, there's price transparency. It's easier for consumers to tell if a deal is good or bad. This leads to a more competitive market and overall better productivity.
Well, as Ms. Chavez also said, there are some disadvantages that were considered when deciding to create the euro. One of them is the united monetary policy. This may or may not be good for some countries, but one of the things that's a disadvantage about it is that countries no longer have the chance to influence their economy using the monetary policy as a tool. However, along with this, the ECB, who has control of the monetary policy, cannot control the monetary policy to help only one country because each country has different economic situations and statuses. So by helping one, it could potentially harm another country. Along with this, each country.
Euro area nations also give up the tool they use with their own currency of competitive devaluation. If you take an export-based country like Germany, they most likely would like a weaker currency, which stimulates export. Their economy is based on exports. So a weaker currency could stimulate their economy. But we should keep in mind that some euro area nations do have debt levels that are of concerning levels. We do believe that at the moment the euro area has the potential to solve these problems in the short term, but it's imperative that in the long term, the euro area seeks reforms so that there are consequences to euro area nations that are reckless with their fiscal expenditures and such.
Okay, let's move on to another question. I think that was very comprehensive, thank you.
Okay.
So you had quite an extensive diagnosis of the unemployment problem in Spain, and you put a lot of emphasis on the structural rigidities in the labor market. One of you mentioned the term structural unemployment. Can you tell me what you understand by that term? What is structural unemployment?
Structural unemployment in the economy is where the skills of the current workforce don't really connect with the skills necessary in the economy at the moment.
Right. Right, and so at the moment, what we were focusing on with that one is construction workers. What happened with the construction boom is that it's very arguable that the construction industry was employing an artificially high amount, and so after it collapsed and these were laid off, a lot of these skills were not as applicable elsewhere.
Also, there's been a lot of structural unemployment with the youth, which is why we said as a part of our solution is to increase the availability of apprenticeships so the youth will have that experience later in life when they're searching for jobs.
In terms of youth unemployment, you said it was about 40% right now in Spain. That's pretty high, and one of your solutions was to reduce severance benefits. Now, youth were never, is that correct?
It's
Yes.
for youth.
Right.
40% for youth, yes.
Right, and so they were never employed in the first place, I can imagine. So how much would that really save you to kind of cut those benefits?
Well, the way we feel is that severance payments act as a disincentive for firms to take on employment contracts. And if we reduce severance payments, we lessen the costs of an employment contract in the country and for companies, and that could push Spanish companies towards employing youth.
And then in addition to that, I'm not sure if this is exactly what you're getting at, but you're saying that they might not have anything to rely on. Well, the thing is that, yes, they might not get severance payment from the company that they're previously employed at, but they can still apply for unemployment benefits if they had worked previously. And even, let's say they were employed in a temporary contract, they didn't get severance payment, they can still apply for unemployment benefits and unemployment assistance. And then even if it comes to that, they could apply for welfare system. There is a welfare system in Spain. So we think that right now, the unemployment system is just too generous, and that's providing a disincentive for firms to hire workers, or for workers to look for jobs.
Spain's unemployment rate's higher than Greece and Portugal and Ireland, yet the markets seem to be leaving it alone for now. So what makes it different than those other countries?
Complex question. Well, we've seen that a few months ago, Spain did take some steps in reducing their debt and deficit levels. They implemented, I would say, pretty severe austerity measures, which could have added perceived credibility into markets. And Spanish economy has begun to recover.
Some of the austerity measures, for example, are cutting government official pay, and they are cutting also some welfare benefits.
So you seem to be saying that the market is rewarding Spain for what it's doing, for its reforms, is that right? Whereas
Yeah,
it's not,
to
whereas
an
it's punishing
To an
us.
To an extent, yeah.
And one of the other things that some markets may look at Spain, they might look at Spain and they might look at a stable market because they might think that they have the capability to get rid of this debt in the long term.
Right.
And so perhaps like through an increase in taxes or whatever, they believe that Spain has the ability to pay off this debt. And so they are not in such a bad situation as let's say, Portugal or
So let me
Greece.
just
as you
quickly
said.
ask, why didn't Spain undertake these reforms before if they're in Spain's best interest?
So, what was the question?
Why didn't Spain undertake they're reforms before if they're such a good thing for Spain?
Like as in before the debt
Before the
crisis hit?
yeah.
Well, I think that's simply because there wasn't really any incentive to. I mean, yes, the ECB and the Stability and Growth Pact did set out limits. However, there wasn't really anything enforcing this. And so it didn't really either reward fiscal responsibility or provide consequences, like bad consequences for a fiscal irresponsibility. And so that's one of the things that we are really proposing, is that there needs to be something to keep a lot of these countries in check so that this does not happen again and that in the future the euro can move forward and become even more prosperous than it is today.
Austerity measures aren't something that people of a nation want to hear when they turn on the news either.
That's maybe true. Okay, thank you very much indeed for your presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.